The winter of 1843 was unlike anything recorded in the Northeastern Territories. It wasn't just cold. It was a slow, merciless suffocation of the land, one that turned the sky white, the soil iron hard, and the breath of every living creature into a fragile ribbon of smoke. But what happened in the small, forgotten settlement of Briar Hollow was far darker than a winter storm. It became a chapter of history that scholars whisper about, a tale so grotesque and so deeply unsettling that even the archives of the county courthouse have sealed away most of the surviving documents. What remains of the story survives only through scattered journals, a handful of reports, and the testimony of the single man who walked out of Briar Hollow alive. Briar Hollow wasn't meant to exist. It was built on the edge of a dense and ancient woodland where sunlight struggled to break through the crooked branches. Travelers in the early 1800s used to warn each other not to cross into the grove after dusk. The forest had a reputation for strange echoes, sudden silences, and something local tribes described simply as a watching hunger. But settlers ignored old warnings, as settlers often did. By the fall of 1843, 37 men, women, and children lived there, believing they could outlast the brutal northern winter with a stockpile of dried meat, grain, and salted fish. But the cold came earlier than anyone predicted. First as a frost that killed their final harvest, then as a storm that lasted 9 days, burying the village in a thick cage of snow. When the skies finally cleared, their food stores had already begun to spoil. Something had gotten in, rats, they first assumed, but the bite marks didn't match anything they recognized. The villagers patched holes, set traps, and rationed what remained. But each night, more food vanished. Something was stealing from them. And it wasn't stopping. By the third week, the hunger gnawed at every ribcage. People grew pale, slow, irritable. The storm outside had turned the world into a white tomb. No rescue party was coming. No shipments could get through. The children cried until they had no strength to cry anymore. The elders whispered that starvation was a more painful death than freezing. And then, on the 22nd night of winter, the first villager disappeared. Her name was Anna Weaver, a schoolteacher barely 20 years old. She had been seen going to the well at dusk. She never returned. The men searched for her, their lanterns flickering in the snow-choked wind, shouting her name until their voices cracked. They found nothing, not even tracks. It was as if the storm itself had swallowed her whole. Her disappearance fractured the village. Some believed she had run into the woods. Others whispered that the storm had taken her. But a few swore they had seen something standing at the edge of the trees that night, a thin, tall shape with limbs too long, watching the lanterns bob through the dark. Panic spread like infection. People refused to leave their homes. They barricaded doors and shuttered windows. For 3 more nights, nothing happened. Then the second villager disappeared. This time, it was a farmer named Jonah. His door was found open, snow piled inside, but the rest of the room untouched, except for one detail that chilled everyone to the bone. His boots were still by the fire. He hadn't walked out. Something had walked in. By the end of the month, 3 more had vanished. And then the first body appeared. It was discovered half buried in the snow near the well, frozen stiff, eyes wide open and mouth twisted into a scream. The flesh on the arms was torn away, the ribs cracked apart as if by bare hands, and most horrifying of all, deep, human bite marks ran across the bone. The villagers realized the truth too late. Whatever was attacking them was eating them. But the worst truth came later, when they discovered that the creature haunting them was not from the woods, it was from inside the village, and the hunger spreading through Briar Hollow was no longer human. In the days following the discovery of the mangled corpse near the well, Briar Hollow was consumed by hysteria. Children were kept hidden, doors barricaded, and windows nailed shut with whatever scraps of wood could be torn from furniture. The townsfolk gathered inside the chapel, the warmest building left, its old stone walls trapping the heat from the few remaining candles. Fear radiated from every face. They whispered theories in trembling breaths, each more disturbing than the last. Some believed a wild animal had broken into the village. Others swore something supernatural was stalking them, but a growing number of villagers, especially those who had seen the bite marks up close, understood a horrifying possibility. Those wounds weren't made by an animal at all. They were human. Sheriff Elias Crow, one of the few with a steady voice left, stood at the front of the chapel. A rugged man in his early 40s, he tried to steady the panic. though even he looked exhausted, thin, gaunt, and haunted by sleepless nights. No one leaves their homes alone, he said. No one moves through the village without another at their side. We don't know who or what is responsible yet, but we will find out, and we'll survive this winter, all of us. But the villagers didn't believe him. They could see it in his hollow eyes, in the tremble of his gloved hands. Elias himself was starving, just like the rest of them. Fremia changes men. It makes them desperate. It makes them unpredictable. It makes them dangerous. By now, food had become more valuable than gold. Families accused each other of hoarding. A mother slapped her neighbor across the face for claiming she heard whispers of a secret stores. A man punched the priest for suggesting that the disappearances might be punishment for a turning from God. And every night, the storm outside howled like a living thing circling the village, waiting for the right moment to smother them. On the fourth night after the first body was found, a scream shattered the silence. It tore through the village like a blade. Lanterns flickered to life. Doors burst open. People stumbled into the cold. The sound had come from the Miller home at the far edge of Briar Hollow, a small log cabin half buried in snow. Sheriff Crow and several men rushed there immediately. They found the front door shattered inward, the hinges ripped out as though from incredible force. Inside, the house was in ruins, chairs overturned, shelves broken, papers and clothes strewn across the floor. But the most chilling sight was the large streak of blood smeared across the wall, trailing toward the back bedroom. When they entered the room, they found Clara Miller crouched in the corner, shivering violently, her eyes wide with terror. She clutched her young daughter against her chest, rocking back and forth, unable to speak. Her husband, Daniel, was gone, for haspa prints led toward the door, and then out into the storm, where the wind had already erased them. But something else was wrong. Clara's hands were stained with blood, her lips too. Sheriff Crow approached slowly, gently asking her what had happened. At first, she was silent. Then she whispered a sentence the men would remember for the rest of their lives. It wasn't something outside. It was someone inside. Someone who's starving. Someone who's losing their mind. Before Crow could ask more, she fainted. That night, the villagers made a grim decision. They would search every house for hidden food. If someone was hoarding, it needed to be found. If someone was responsible for the murders, they had to catch them before the hunger claimed more lives. What they found wasn't what they expected. It was worse. In the house of Jonah Becker, one of the men who had disappeared earlier, they found scratches along the inside of his door. Deep, frantic claw marks. And on the floor beneath a loose board, they found a small pile of bones. Human bones. Fresh ones. Gnawed clean. The realization spread through Briar Hollow like wildfire. Someone had been eating the missing villagers long before the first body appeared. Someone had been hiding the remains, consuming them in secret. Someone who still lived among them. Fear twisted into paranoia. Neighbors stared at each other with hollow suspicion. Everyone wondered who among them had crossed the line between starvation and savagery. But the truth, as the winter would soon reveal, was far more horrifying. Because the cannibal wasn't just one person. The hunger had begun spreading, and Briar Hollow was starting to devour itself. The discovery of the gnawed bones under Jonah Becker's floorboards marked a turning point in Briar Hollow. Until that moment, the villagers had clung to a fragile hope that the terror stalking them came from outside, from the woods, from something inhuman. But now they understood the truth. The real monster was inside their own homes. They began looking at each other not as neighbors, but as potential predators. People they'd shared meals with, prayed with, laughed with just weeks ago were now suspects in a crime that defied sanity. Sheriff Elias Crow tried to impose order. He ordered watches to be placed at every home, torches lit through the night, and groups assigned to guard the remaining food supplies. But food supplies no longer meant dried meat or rotting grain. Now the real danger was human flesh and the growing number of villagers who gazed at one another with sunken, feverish hunger. Hunger changes the mind. That truth was becoming clearer every day. Children grew weak and thin. Adults snapped at each other like wild dogs. Those who once spoke softly now snarled. No one slept soundly. No one trusted anyone. Even Elias himself felt his sanity slipping. Every night, as his stomach clamped in pain, he wondered how much longer he could resist the instinct to survive, no matter the cost. On the seventh night, after Jonah's bones were discovered, a terrible storm swept through Briar Hollow. The wind screamed against the cabins, snow hammered the roofs. The temperature dropped so low that frost formed inside the houses. Everyone huddled in their corners, praying the storm would not tear their homes apart. But something else happened that night, something far worse. A young boy named Thomas Gray stumbled into the chapel just before dawn, barefoot, shivering violently, and covered in blood. His eyes were wide and vacant, as though he had seen something no child should ever witness. The priest wrapped him in blankets, trying to warm him, while Sheriff Crow knelt beside him and asked what had happened. Thomas's voice trembled. Mama changed. The words chilled the room. Thomas explained that during the storm, his mother, Ruth, had grown restless. She paced the house, muttering under her breath, clutching her stomach in agony. She snapped at her husband, at Thomas, at shadows, as though something inside her was clawing for release. When the storm reached its peak, Ruth suddenly froze, staring at something only she could see. Her breathing became ragged. Thomas said she whispered, "I can smell it. I can smell the meat." Then she lunged at her husband. Thomas's father fought back, but Ruth was no longer herself. She clawed, bit, and tore at him with a strength no starving woman should possess. Thomas ran for the door, slipping through the snow barefoot as he heard his father's screams fill the cabin. He didn't look back. The chapel fell silent. No one knew what to say. Not until Elias stood up and ordered a small group to follow him to the Gray residence. Thomas begged them not to go, sobbing that his mother wasn't human anymore. Elias assured him it had to be done. As they approached the Gray cabin, the storm had settled, leaving an eerie quiet over the village. The door hung open. Snow had drifted inside, and there in the center of the room lay Thomas's father, what was left of him. But the most horrifying detail was the trail of bloody footprints leading out the back of the house into the woods. Small footprints, bare, human. Ruth had fled into the forest. The men followed the tracks only until the tree line, but none dared go deeper. Everyone had heard stories of the woods, stories of the watching hunger, of voices that whispered to men until they lost themselves. Now, with the fresh horror before them, those old tales felt frighteningly real. Something in the woods had called to Ruth. Something had answered her hunger. When they returned, Sheriff Crow made a declaration that shook the village. And no one who gives in to the hunger can be allowed to stay inside Briar Hollow. At first, the villagers thought he meant hunting for Ruth. But when he pointed it to Thomas, still trembling in the chapel, he made the meaning painfully clear. Anyone who shows signs of changing must be removed. Mothers gasped. Men protested. But the truth was undeniable. The hunger was spreading like an infection. If they didn't stop it, Briar Hollow would consume itself before winter's end. And as they argued, as voices rose in panic and fear, none of them noticed the shadow standing between the trees at the edge of the village, watching them with hollow, starving eyes. The deeper you travel into the story of that forgotten village, the more it begins to feel less like history and more like a warning, one written in the cold breath of those who didn't survive. By the 4th month of that brutal winter, the villagers had stopped pretending things would return to normal. The snow never melted, the sun barely rose, and the wind howled like something alive, scraping against wooden doors and rattling window frames as if demanding to be let inside. Food had run out long ago. What remained in their storage rooms was nothing more than brittle grains, frozen roots, and a few jars of broth scraped to the bottom. Children cried through the nights. Mothers tried to quiet them with stories. And men wandered the village paths with hollow eyes, searching for anything. Anything that could be eaten. But the forests were dead, rivers locked under thick ice, and hunters who went too far were swallowed by snowdrifts that seemed to move like shifting sand. That was when the first body was found. Not murdered, not attacked. Just frozen, curled beside the church steps, hands twisted as though reaching for salvation. He was an old man, someone nobody considered valuable enough to share food with, someone who often rambled about spirits and past sins. His death was not surprising. But what happened afterward was, when Father O'Malley walked past the church early that morning, he noticed the body was no longer lying the way it had been the night before. The limbs were repositioned. The torso was stripped of chunks of flesh too cleanly removed to be the work of animals. And the snow around him, disturbed, dragged, smeared, told a story the villagers refused to acknowledge. They buried him quickly, fearing what the truth implied, but whispers began spreading anyway. Someone in the village had eaten him, fear hardened into paranoia. Doors were locked earlier, conversations ended abruptly when footsteps approached, and families stopped trusting even their closest neighbors. Hunger had begun changing people. Their faces were sunken, cheeks sharp as bone blades, eyes too large and too desperate. By now, the villagers understood that if no miracle arrived, someone else would be next. They prayed, they rationed, they waited. But prayers froze in the air and shattered like ice crystals. And then, on the coldest night yet, the second death happened, this time inside a home. A young man named Elias, once strong enough to chop wood through storms, collapsed in front of his family, his breath failing in ragged gasps. His mother wept, but even she knew she didn't have the strength to spare tears for long. When he finally passed, the family sat in silence, staring at his still body. Hours later, after darkness swallowed the village, someone quietly exited their house. And by dawn, Elias' body was gone. The villagers searched, shouting his name as if he could answer, pretending they didn't already know the truth. But what they found was worse than any nightmare they had imagined. In the forest clearing, half buried under frost, lay pieces of him, bones snapped in half, marrow scraped clean. Flesh carved with the precision of someone who had done this before. Someone who was no longer afraid. At morning, panic erupted in the village square. Mothers clutched their children, men grabbed what remained of tools, and everyone shouted accusations. The monster wasn't outside their walls. It was one of them. They wanted to blame the youngest, the weakest, the strangest. But deep down, every villager knew they were all capable of the same thing. Hunger had stripped away humanity the way frost strips bark from a dying tree. And that realization, that cannibalism had taken root among them, there was the moment the village ceased being a community and became a hunting ground. No one slept. No one trusted. No one believed they would make it to spring. In that moment, the village became something else entirely, something history would later try to erase. By the time the fifth death struck the village, the line between survival and savagery had vanished entirely. No one dared step outside after dusk, yet the true terror wasn't the cold anymore. It was the footsteps that crept between homes, soft and deliberate, belonging to someone who knew the layout of every street, every creaking plank, every blind corner. People weren't starving now. People were being hunted, and worse, they suspected it was not the desperation of many, but the intent of one. The villagers began whispering about a figure they called the night feeder, someone who moved with unnatural patience, and who always seemed to know which house was weakest, who was closest to collapse, who wouldn't be missed until morning. It started with strange disappearances. Not whole bodies this time, just pieces, a hand left on a doorstep, a rib cage hanging from a frozen fence like a grotesque warning, a trail of blood leading to the old well, staining the snow crimson, as though the ground itself were bleeding. Each gruesome discovery pushed the villagers deeper into hysteria. They held emergency meetings inside the church, the only place that felt remotely safe, though even that was an illusion. Father O'Malley placed holy candles everywhere, their flames trembling as if aware of something unseen lurking just beyond the wooden walls. But no amount of prayer could cleanse the air of the metallic smell that lingered. Blood mixed with winter rot. For the first time, the villagers began turning on each other openly. Accusations erupted like sparks in dry tinder. One man claimed he saw his neighbor dragging a sack into the woods at night. A woman insisted her cousin's husband had meat in his home that smelled nothing like any animal. Fists flew, voices cracked, and the fragile threads holding the village together snapped one by one. Children hid beneath their beds as adults shouted, furniture overturned, and the once peaceful square became a battlefield of paranoia. In the end, no one knew who to trust, and that was exactly the moment the real danger slipped into power. Because the truth, though no one dared say it aloud, was that the killings were too deliberate, too methodical, too ritualistic to be acts of starving villagers losing control. Someone was enjoying this. Someone was choosing victims with care. The fifth body proved it. It belonged to Mara, one of the most beloved women in the village. A midwife who had delivered half of the villagers with her own hands. She had disappeared for only one night. By sunrise, the search party found her sitting upright against a tree at the forest's edge, her face gently lifted as if she were listening to the wind. Her eyes were gone. Her tongue was gone. And carved into the skin of her arm in jagged, trembling cuts were the words, "I was saved." The message froze everyone where they stood. It wasn't just killing now. It was a statement, a confession, or a warning. Father O'Malley knelt beside her, trembling. He whispered that such markings were not the work of a starving mind. They were the work of someone who believed in something. A ritual, a cleansing, a purpose. The villagers backed away, some sobbing, some retching, all terrified that their nightmare was no longer a breakdown of humanity, but the rise of something far older, far colder. Stories of ancient winter demons resurfaced, creatures said to wander during the harshest months, feeding on those who strayed from the warmth of their homes. But whether it was folklore or a man following the script of folklore, no one could tell. That night, no one slept. Families barricaded their doors with chairs, shutters, anything heavy enough to resist whatever stalked outside. But the wind carried new sounds through the village, soft humming like a lullaby, footsteps crunching slowly across the snow. And somewhere far off, a voice whispered through the darkness, almost gentle, almost tender, "I will save you too." And in that moment, the villagers realized something horrifying. The cannibal among them didn't believe he was killing. He believed he was saving them. And that twisted belief was far more dangerous than hunger ever could be. By the morning after Mara's mutilated body was found, the village had entered a state of silent, suffocating panic. The church bell, normally used to signal emergencies, remained still because no one dared to ring it. They feared sound itself might draw the creature, or the man, or the thing that moved between their homes. Every step on the snow outside, every soft creak of wood, every gust of wind brushing against the shutters felt like a warning. The village was no longer a place where people lived. It had become a place where people hid. Even the bravest men walked only in pairs now, clutching axes, knives, or rusted tools they called weapons. They weren't prepared for a beast, but they were desperate to believe they had a chance against a man. It was the only hope they had left. Yet hope was in short supply. Food had run out. Horses, goats, and even dogs had either frozen to death or vanished, likely taken by the same figure who was now hunting people. Children cried in hunger, but their mothers silenced them quickly, for fear the sound would carry. The snow reflecting the pale winter sun made everything look ghostly, as if the world itself were drained of color. And in that drained world, the villagers realized something grim. Soon, desperation would return. Soon, starving would not just be a memory. It would be every hour, every breath. And in that state of weakness, the night feeder would strike again. So they did the only thing they could. They tried to track him. A group of 8 men and 1 woman volunteered to patrol the outer edges of the village. They moved silently, sweeping the forest line, the abandoned barns, and the frozen stream where footprints often appeared. But they found nothing except a single chilling piece of evidence. In a clearing behind the Decker family barn, someone had carved a large, perfectly symmetrical circle into the snow. At its center burned a candle, still warm, still flickering, meaning whoever had been there was close, very close. And around the circle were 3 sets of footprints, 2 belonging to villagers they recognized by shoe pattern, and 1 that didn't match anyone. Not in size, not in shape. The prints were long, narrow, uneven, almost as if the person walked with a limp. The sight broke the nerves of Thomas Decker, who screamed that the demon of winter had come for them, that the stories his grandmother told were real, that the Wendigo, the eater of flesh and keeper of lost souls, walked the villages where famine struck. But O'Malley, trembling, insisted the truth was worse than folklore. The precise circle, the placement of the candle, the staged bodies, these were not the actions of a creature. They were the actions of a believer, someone who followed ritual. Someone whose madness was methodical. And methodical madness meant one thing. They were not dealing with a starving human losing their mind, but a human who wanted to become something else. That night, a storm arrived without warning. Snow fell fast, thick, scraping against windows like claws. The wind screamed through the narrow alleys, rattling doors, shaking loose shutters, and making every home feel inches away from collapse. People huddled close together, wrapped in blankets, holding knives or wooden crosses. The storm drowned out every sound, except one. At the peak of the blizzard, when visibility was near zero, the entire village heard it, a slow, steady knocking, not frantic, not forceful, just patient. Knock, knock, knock. Each home claimed to hear it, though none could pinpoint where it started. Some said it came from the east end, others from the abandoned mill, others swore it came from atop the frozen well. But the rhythm was unmistakable. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks again. In the Coleman household, the knocking became so loud that Mara's closest friend, Elise, whispered that she felt it inside her bones. She begged her husband not to check the door, but he insisted the storm had blown wood loose. He approached cautiously, and when he placed his hand on the doorknob, the knocking stopped instantly. Silence. Utter, suffocating silence. And then a voice, so close he felt its breath through the wood whispered, "Are you ready to be saved?" Elise screamed, grabbing her children and fleeing to the back room. Her husband stumbled away from the door, white-faced, shaking uncontrollably. For the rest of the night, no one in the Coleman home spoke a word. They simply listened as footsteps circled the house, slow, deliberate, unhurried. It was the longest night the village had ever endured, and when dawn finally broke, dim and gray, the knocking had stopped. The footsteps had stopped, the storm had calmed, but 2 houses were empty. Completely empty. Not a body, not a drop of blood. Just silence. So absolute it felt like the world had swallowed them whole. By sunrise, the storm had passed, but the quiet it left behind was worse than the winds howling. The village felt hollow, too still, too untouched, as if the blizzard had wiped away every trace of life except fear itself. When the patrol searched the 2 empty houses, they found the same scene in both. A single chair placed in the center of the room, facing the doorway, as though someone had been waiting. No signs of struggle, no footprints leading out, no blood, just faint scratches on the wooden floor, parallel lines perfectly straight, as if something had been dragged across it very slowly. And on the wall behind each chair, written in what looked disturbingly like ash mixed with frozen sweat, were the same 3 words, "The winter chooses. The winter chooses." This was not random anymore. It was ritual. The villagers knew it, even if they refused to say it out loud. Fear became a living thing, thick, suffocating, crawling beneath the skin. The air tasted different now, like metal, like fear had weight. When people spoke, they whispered. When they walked, they moved as if afraid the ground would echo. And yet, despite all the terror, despite the markings and disappearances, something even more unnerving spread through the village. A growing sense of acceptance. As if somehow, the killings and vanishings were beginning to make a twisted kind of sense. As if the villagers were quietly preparing themselves for their fate. But 3 people refused to accept it. Elise, Father O'Malley, and Jonah, Mara's older brother. They met inside the church shortly after dawn, determined to understand what was happening. O'Malley spread out every old manuscript, every forgotten sermon note, every winter folklore scrap he had collected over the years. Jonah slammed a fist down, demanding action instead of stories, demanding they hunt the monster. But O'Malley shook his head and whispered something Jonah didn't want to hear. "This isn't a hunt. This is a rite." He pointed to a passage in an old journal recorded by a traveler decades earlier. It spoke of a winter purifier, a person chosen by famine, consumed by madness, who believed they had been selected to cleanse the weak so the strong could survive. A person who believed starvation was divine instruction. A person who turned cannibalism into a calling. Elise insisted it had to be a villager, someone they all knew, someone whose face they trusted. Only a person familiar with the layout of every home could move around so quietly. Only someone raised here would know the weak spots in the walls, the patterns of footsteps, the habits of the families. Jonah, fueled by grief and rage, vowed he would kill whoever it was, even if it turned out to be someone he once called friend. His voice echoed through the church, trembling with fury, as he declared he wasn't afraid of demons or men. But O'Malley lowered his voice and said something that chilled Elise to her core. What if he's not afraid of dying? What if he believes death is the gift he's giving? The question hung heavy in the cold air. Elise couldn't shake the memory of the soft voice whispering through their door, promising a salvation in a tone almost gentle. That was no monster. That was a person consumed by belief. And belief, taken to its furthest edge, was far more terrifying than hunger or madness. Their meeting was interrupted by a sudden, sharp scream from outside, raw, anguished, echoing through the frozen village like a blade through silence. They sprinted toward the sound, slipping on ice, crashing through drifts of snow. The scream came from the Miller house, but by the time they reached it, the door was wide open. Inside, Mrs. Miller was on her knees, shaking violently, pointing at the crib beside her. The blankets were rumpled, the wooden rails were broken, and the baby, her only child, was gone. Jonah felt the world tilt. Elise ran to comfort the woman, her own hands trembling uncontrollably. But O'Malley's eyes drifted to the window, where a single, fresh footprint stood on the sill, leading outward, not inward. The night feeder had been inside with them, watching, waiting, choosing. And outside, carved into the snow beneath the window, were the same 3 words written with a careful, deliberate hand. The winter chooses. But this time, beneath the message was a 4th word, one they had never seen before. A word that made Jonah's breath freeze in his chest and Elise's heart drop into her stomach. An X. Jonah stared at the word next carved into the snow as if the ground itself had spoken to him. His breath clouded in the frozen air, his jaw clenched so tightly he felt his teeth ache. Elise grabbed his arm, whispering that they needed to return to the church, regroup, think. Regroup, think. But Jonah ripped free from her grip. He wasn't thinking anymore. He was burning. The baby's disappearance had shattered whatever fragile restraint he still held. This wasn't just survival now. This wasn't even vengeance. This was personal, and the night feeder had chosen the wrong family to provoke. Jonah stormed off toward the forest edge, ignoring Elise's pleas and O'Malley's warning that no one should be alone. The storm clouds overhead thickened again, swirling like a dark omen, as if the sky itself knew something terrible was about to unfold. O'Malley and Elise had no choice but to follow him, though they struggled to keep up with his furious pace. Snow crunched beneath their boots, each step sinking deeper as the wind cut across their faces. Jonah moved like a man possessed, fueled by grief and fury, crashing through the underbrush with no concern for stealth. But as they reached the old birch grove, a place villagers avoided even in better winters, they noticed something strange. The trees were marked. Every trunk had long, vertical cuts carved into its bark, as if someone had been dragging a blade or fingernails across them. The marks were fresh, the wood still pale beneath the peeling bark, and at the center of the grove stood a small pile of stones arranged with unnatural care. On top of the stones sat a threadbare piece of cloth. Baby cloth, the miller's baby's blanket, stiffened by cold dusted with snow. Elise gasped, covering her mouth as tears filled her eyes. O'Malley stepped forward cautiously, whispering a prayer under his breath. But Jonah stormed ahead, grabbing the blanket with shaking hands. He lifted it, inspecting every inch for blood, for signs, for anything that would confirm what he feared most. The blanket was intact, clean, untorn. The baby might still be alive. That sliver of hope only fueled his rage further. He dropped the blanket and turned toward the deeper woods, only to freeze. From behind one of the trees, a shadow shifted. It moved slowly, deliberately. Jonah lifted his axe and stepped forward. Elise grabbed O'Malley's sleeve, whispering, "He's here. He's watching us." Her voice trembled so intensely she could barely form the words. O'Malley, his breath uneven, scanned the trees but saw nothing, only the subtle ripple of a cloaked figure disappearing behind a trunk. Jonah lunged forward, shouting. But before he could reach the spot, the figure vanished deeper into the woods, moving with a smoothness that felt inhuman. Not running, gliding, as if the forest opened for him. Jonah gave chase. Elise screamed after him, but he didn't stop. She and O'Malley ran after him, hearts pounding, slipping on hidden roots buried beneath the snow. They followed Jonah's footprints, but soon the track split. One set veering left, another right. Jonas? The night feeders? Both? The wood swallowed sound, leaving them deaf to direct. Panic surged through Elise. She spun around, calling Jonas' name over and over, but the forest gave no answer. Only the whisper of distant wind. Then O'Malley stiffened. Ahead of them, just beyond a cluster of pine trees, stood a shape. Tall, thin, absolutely still. Elise's heart hammered as she grabbed O'Malley's arm. The figure wore a tattered winter coat, but the face was obscured by a hood. Snow clung to its shoulders like dust on an old corpse. O'Malley raised his lantern with a trembling hand. The light flickered, casting an amber glow across the snow. And then the figure moved, slowly lifting one arm, pointing a single finger toward the ground, not at Elise, not at O'Malley, at something lying half buried in snow. Elise's stomach twisted as she stepped closer. It was Jonah's axe. The blade smeared with frost, and something dark, something fresh. She dropped to her knees, brushing snow aside in frantic sweeps. Beneath the axe, buried in the snow, lay footprints, only one set, not Jonah's heavy boots. These were the same strange, uneven prints they had seen before. The night feeders, and they were fresh. Very fresh, very fresh, very fresh. Elise looked up sharply, but the figure was gone. vanished into the trees as silently as it had appeared. O'Malley swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's leading us." Elise felt the truth strike her like cold water. He didn't want them to chase him. He wanted them to follow him. And somewhere deeper in the forest, Jonah was alone. Alone with a hunter who believed the winter had chosen him. Elise sprinted through the forest with O'Malley struggling behind her, both of them stumbling over hidden roots, slipping on patches of ice that glimmered faintly beneath the snow. Their breaths came out in ragged clouds, but neither dared stop, not when Jonah was somewhere ahead, possibly injured, possibly worse. The trees grew denser as they pushed forward, their branches bending inward like ribs of a monstrous cage. The deeper they went, the darker the air felt, as if the forest was swallowing the daylight, draining it of warmth. Elise called Jonah's name again and again, her voice cracking against the cold. No answer came, only the eerie stillness of a place untouched by hope. The forest had changed. It was subtle at first, strange patterns in the snow, odd arrangements of branches leaning together unnaturally, like someone had deliberately shaped the landscape. Then Elise noticed something far more disturbing. Bones. Small ones at first. Rabbit, fox, bird scattered near tree roots, stripped clean. But soon she and O'Malley began passing larger remains. Deer ribs, a boar skull, even what looked like human finger bones half buried beneath frost. It was a trail, Elise realized, a macabre breadcrumb path left behind intentionally. And at the end of it would be Jonah, or a body, or something worse. They paused when they reached a clearing neither had seen before, though every villager knew these woods. It was circular, unnaturally perfect, and silent. Not even wind dared cross it. In the center stood a crude wooden structure, part altar, part cage, part gallows, pieced together from broken branches, splintered planks, and rope that looked suspiciously like torn clothing. Something hung from its center. Elise felt her knees weaken as she stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. It was Jonah's coat, torn, frozen stiff, dangling like the shed skin of an animal. But there was no body, swaying gently even though the air was dead still. O'Malley murmured a prayer, his voice trembling. Elise didn't move. Her mind raced, trying to understand. Was this a warning? A trophy? A deception? Before she could decide, a sound broke the silence. A low, rasping breath. Not hers. Not O'Malley's, it came from behind the altar. Elise's heartbeat hammered in her ears as she slowly stepped around the structure. Her boots crunched on the snow. Once, twice, 3 times, and then she saw him. Jonah, lying on his side, his hands bound with strips of cloth, his face pale and streaked with blood. But he was alive, barely. Elise dropped to her knees, reaching for him, but Jonah's eyes snapped open in panic. He shook his head violently. Wheezing through cracked lips, a run, he's still. Here, Elise froze. O'Malley turned sharply, scanning the tree line, but the woods were empty. Jonah's breaths were shallow, his body shaking with exhaustion. He wanted you to find me, Jonah choked out. He left me alive on purpose. Elise's stomach twisted. She asked him, why not kill him? Why leave him here? Jonah swallowed hard, eyes glistening with fear. Because he wanted to show us that the winter doesn't take the weak. O'Malley grabbed Jonah's shoulder. Where is he now? Jonah, where did he go? Jonah began to shake violently, eyes darting around as if seeing something none of them could. He said he wasn't choosing at random. He watches hunger. He watches fear. He said the ones who cling to life the hardest. Those are the ones the winter wants most. Then Jonah's breath hitched. His voice dropped to a whisper. He said he'll take someone tonight. Someone strong, someone who resists. A sound cracked through the clearing, sharp, deliberate, a twig snapping under weight. Elise looked toward the trees. At first she saw nothing. Then she saw it. A figure standing among the trunks, still as a statue, watching them. The hood, the coat, the long uneven stance, the night feeder. Elise felt her chest tighten. O'Malley lifted Jonah with trembling arms, whispering that they had to leave, had to run. But the figure didn't move. It simply watched, its head tilted slowly to one side, almost curious, almost amused. Then, in a voice that carried across the frozen air like a whisper carved from ice, it spoke. No winter chooses tonight. Elise's blood ran cold, Jonah's trembling intensified. O'Malley tightened his grip. And then, in a single blink of swirling snow, the figure was gone. But the clearing echoed with 4 final words that did not belong to any wind. And it chooses one of you. The last night in Briar Hollow descended like a coffin lid. Snow fell endlessly, muffling the cries of the villagers and smothering the forest in a suffocating white blanket. Inside the church, Elise, O'Malley, and Jonah huddled together, each aware that dawn might not come, or if it did, they might be the only ones left to see it. The candles burned low, their flickering flames casting grotesque shadows across the walls. Every noise, the groan of timber, the gust of wind, the creak of frozen snow settling, made them flinch. The village had become a trap. The night feeder had been patient, meticulous, and now he was ready for his final act. Jonah whispered hoarsely, "He's picking tonight. He said he chooses the strong, the stubborn, the ones who fight to survive." His eyes darted to Elise and O'Malley. "We're here, that's why he's coming." O'Malley gripped a wooden cross in one hand and a rusted axe in the other, mumbling prayers that sounded increasingly hollow. Elise's fingers shook so violently she could barely hold the lantern. Every instinct in her screamed to flee, yet the church doors were barred, the windows nailed shut, and the snow outside formed a wall higher than any of them could climb. There was no escape. The night feeder didn't just hunt, they knew this. They had studied the village, mapped the panic, anticipated the fear. And now, at the edge of this long frozen night, he would finish what he had begun. The first sound came as a whisper, carried through the cracks in the wooden walls. Almost imperceptible. Swoos. At first they thought it was the wind, then the murmur grew into something more deliberate, a soft scraping like nails against wood. The floorboards creaked under invisible weight, and then the knocking started again. 3 slow knocks, pause, 3 slow knocks. The same rhythm that had haunted every night since the disappearances began. Jonah gritted his teeth and whispered, "It's coming. It's here." The church doors shuddered violently. Elise screamed. O'Malley swung his axe at the nearest shutter, and for a moment, the wind's howl covered the thundering pounding of fists against the wood. Then silence. But it was wrong in a way that made their stomachs curl. They turned toward the altar. The lantern flickered, and for a brief instant, they saw it. A shadow, tall and impossibly thin, gliding across the floor, almost touching the walls, but never making a sound. The hooded figure stopped, its head tilted. One arm lifted slowly, pointing at them. And then it spoke, a voice both chillingly calm and monstrously confident. "The winner chooses." The candlelight caught something horrifying. The glint of teeth, not animal teeth. He was transformed by hunger, by madness, by ritual. He was no longer just a villager who had snapped. He had become something else entirely. Something that had embraced the winter, become its voice, its instrument. Jonah lunged forward, screaming. But before he could reach the shadow, it vanished, like smoke in a sudden gust of wind. The doors shook violently again, then quiet. The snow outside seemed to still, as if the storm itself was holding its breath. The 3 of them huddled together, heartbeats pounding, eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. Minutes passed. Hours. No sound. Then a single deliberate step echoed across the church floor, slowly, softly, approaching them. They couldn't see him, but they could feel his presence. The air thickened, smelled faintly of iron and decay. Elise felt a hand brush her shoulder, and instinctively turned. No one was there, but the temperature dropped sharply. Jonah shivered uncontrollably, teeth chattering. O'Malley whispered a prayer, tears running down his face. And then the final words, cold and terrible, cut through the silence. "One will remain. The rest will feed the winter." The church doors burst open. Snow flew in, blinding, freezing, howling like a chorus of the dead. Shadows moved with unnatural speed. Screams erupted, then stopped. Silence swallowed everything. When the morning sun rose, it found Briar Hollow deserted, silent except for the wind and the snow. Some villagers were never seen again. Some say their footprints lead into the forest and vanish mid-step. One lone figure, Jonah, according to later accounts, staggered out, eyes wide with horror, muttering only fragments of what had occurred. Elise and O'Malley, history never recorded them. Only whispers remained, and Briar Hollow, the village that had once stood with families, children, and laughter, became a ghost town, a place where winter did not simply fall. And those who survived carried the memory of the night feeder, the ritual, and the horrifying truth that hunger, fear, and madness combined can erase humanity entirely. To this day, historians and folklorists debate what really happened that winter. Some insist it was famine-induced madness. Others warn it was something older, something inhuman that had waited centuries for the right winter, the right village, the right moment. Whatever it was, one thing is certain. The village that ate its own became a lesson written in blood, snow, and silence. And those who study it never enter the woods after dusk, because in Briar Hollow, the winter still chooses.